Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Your Honor." The government calls Owen Foley.
Owen Foley, called as a witness by the government, having been duly sworn, testified as follows.
The court said, "Please state your name and spell it."
The witness said, Owen Foley, first name Owen, last name Foley.
The court said, "Mr. Foley, I need you to speak right into the microphone."
The witness said, "Yes, Your Honor."
The court said, "You may inquire."
Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Your Honor."
Direct examination. By Ms. Murray.
Good afternoon, Mr. Foley.
Good afternoon.
Where do you work?
I work at the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York.
What is your position at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York?
I'm a paralegal specialist.
What are your duties and responsibilities as a paralegal specialist?
Assisting the Assistant United States Attorney with discovery legal process, trial preparation.
How long have you been a paralegal at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York?
Just about 2 years.
Besides your testimony today in preparation for that testimony, did you have any involvement in this case?
I did not, no.
In advance of your testimony, were you asked to review a government exhibit and verify the accuracy of information in it?
I was.
And when were you asked to review that summary chart?
Roughly a week ago.
Did you review the summary chart for accuracy?
I did.
Is the summary chart based on voluminous records?
It is.
Were those records provided to you by the government?
They were.
What types of exhibits, generally speaking, is the summary chart based on?
They were loan payments.
Who decided which exhibits you reviewed and what information to include in the summary chart?
You did.
Did you note corrections to the summary chart to make sure that it was accurate after your review?
I did.
Was the chart revised to reflect your corrections?
It was.
After the chart was revised, is it now accurate?
Yes.
Just to be clear, Mr. Foley, did you review all of the evidence gathered in the government's case here or just the summary chart and the exhibits it's based on?
Just the summary chart and the exhibits that it's based on.
Ms. Murray said, "Ms. Loftus, if you could please put up GX Stip 8, which is in evidence." It's a stipulation between the parties. This reads on page 2 that the parties stipulate and agree that Government Exhibits 1601 through 1849 were lawfully obtained by the government and are authentic business records of the entity indicated on the face of the exhibit that were made at or near the time by or from information transmitted by a person with knowledge of the matter set forth in the record. Such records were kept in the course of a regularly conducted activity, and it was the regular practice of that entity to make the records. On the next page, please, Ms. Loftus. GX Stip 8 also indicates that government exhibits listed in this stipulation, including Government Exhibit 1601 through 1849, may be received as evidence. And Your Honor, pursuant to Stip 8. At this time the government offers the following government exhibits for admission. Government Exhibits 1628, 1630, 1631, 1632, 1634, 1636, 1637, 1639, 1643, 1644, and 1646.
Mr. Skirrick said, "No objection."
The court said, "They are admitted."
Government's Exhibits 1628, 1630, 1631, 1632, 1634, 1636, 1637, 1639, 1643, 1644, and 1646 received in evidence. By Ms. Murray.
Ms. Loftus, we can put that down. And if you could please put up for the witness what's been marked as Government Exhibit Z13. Mr. Foley, do you recognize the document in front of you?
I do.
Is that the summary chart you reviewed in preparation for your testimony today?
It is.
Did you review all of the exhibits this summary chart is based on?
Yes.
Are those exhibits indicated by exhibit number on this chart?
Yes.
Is the chart accurate based on your review?
It is.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, the government offers Government Exhibit Z13.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, if I may have one moment.
Ms. Murray said, Could we just have a moment, please, Your Honor?
The court said, Are you ready?
Ms. Murray said, We just need another moment, Your Honor. Thank you very much.
The court said, Okay.
Mr. Foley, if you could take a look at the document that's on your screen. This is marked for identification as Government Exhibit Z13. And I'm going to give it to Defense Counsel to look at it as well. Is this the summary chart that you reviewed in preparation for your testimony?
Yes.
Ms. Murray said, Defense Counsel is reviewing it before I move to admit. At this time, the government moves to admit Government Exhibit Z13.
Mr. Skirek said, No objection, Your Honor.
The court said, It is admitted.
Government's Exhibit Z13 received in evidence. By Ms. Murray.
If we could please publish. Mr. Foley, looking at this summary chart, what is the title of this chart?
G Club Loan Agreements and Select Investments.
And generally speaking, what type of agreements are summarized in this Exhibit Z13?
Various loans ranging from $1 million to $60 million US.
And looking at the second column here. Who is the lender of the majority of these loans that are reflected on Z13?
G Club Operations, LLC.
Mr. Foley, do you know what G Club Operations, LLC is?
I do not.
Looking at the borrower column, what is the borrower listed as reflected for the majority of the loans?
Majority of them are G Club International Limited.
Mr. Foley, do you know what G Club International Limited is?
I do not.
I'd like to look at the various different fields that are reflected in this exhibit. Starting on the leftmost column, what information is reflected there for the loans that are summarized here?
The leftmost column is the date of the loan.
And then the next column, what is that information?
The lender.
The third column, what does that indicate?
The lender signatory.
And looking at rows 2 and 3, is there?
The court said, What does signatory mean?
The witness said, The name signed on the loan.
The court said, Go ahead.
Ms. Murray said, Thank you, Your Honor. Looking at rows 2 and 3, there's no lender signatory listed there, do you see that?
Yes.
Going to the next column, borrower, what information is reflected there?
The borrower was the name of the borrower listed in the lease agreement in the underlying documents.
And then the next column, what individuals' names are reflected there, if any?
The borrower signatory.
And then the following column is titled Fund Receiver. What information does that reflect from the loan agreements?
The name of the individual or organization that was designated as the fund receiver in the loan agreements.
In the following two columns, first there's amount and then currency. Can you explain what information is reflected there?
The amount was the amount listed on the underlying loan agreement. And the currency was the currency of that amount. A majority are US dollars. There are payments for GPB and CHF as well.
And finally, the rightmost column. Does that reflect the government exhibit numbers of the supporting documents?
Yes, it does.
We can take this down for a moment, Ms. Loftus. I'd like to look at one of those underlying loan agreements. Mr. Foley, and then, we'll look at the chart. Ms. Loftus, if you could please pull up GXGC 515. And zoom in on the text portion, please. Mr. Foley, what is the name of the entity listed at the top of this document?
Hamilton Digital Assets FDSP.
And do you know what Hamilton Digital Assets is?
I do not.
What information does this reflect, the first bold entry here?
The transfer is from G Club Operations LLC.
And what is the transfer to based on this document?
G Club International Limited.
And the name of the fund?
Hamilton Digital Assets FDSP.
Now looking at the effective date of the transfer, what date is listed there?
March 6, 2021.
And the next field indicates $2 amounts with different dates. Can you read each of those, please?
The first one is $20 million on May 6, 2021, and the second is $15 million on May 13, 2021.
Mr. Foley. There are two signatures on this document. Who is the first one based on the typed information below the line?
Howren he.
And what is the title listed for Howren he there?
UBO.
That's on behalf of which party to this agreement?
The transferor.
The next signature, Mr. Foley, what's the type name for that one?
Howren he.
By what title?
Director.
That's on behalf of what entity to this agreement?
The transferee.
Ms. Loftus, if we could please pull up alongside Z13. If we could focus in on the second and third rows of Z13. It's fine if it kind of overlaps. Mr. Foley. Looking at these entries, is there any way to make it larger, Ms. Loftus? Looking at these entries. The second and third entries here on Z13. Do those reflect the information that we just looked at in the legal agreement in GXGC 515?
Yes.
And looking at the dates listed here, the first date in the zoomed out portion is May 6, 2201. What is the dollar amount that's listed for that particular entry?
$20 million.
And looking at the document on the left, GXGC 515, where do we see that information on the loan agreement?
In the fifth bolded section under amount of transfer.
And same question with respect to the second row that's highlighted from GXZ 13 here. What is the date listed for that entry?
May 13, 2021.
And the dollar amount associated with that transfer?
$15 million.
Where do we see that in the source document GXGC 515?
Under the section of the amount of the transfer.
And looking at the portion of GXZ 13, the parties that are listed here for fund receiver and Ms. Loftus. Perhaps we can zoom out and zoom in including the header. Fund receiver for these entries are listed as Hamilton Digital Assets FDSP. Where do we see that information reflected in the loan agreement that's on the left?
Beneath the third bolded section that says name of the fund.
And then looking all the way to the right, Mr. Foley, the GX number that's listed for those two entries. GXGC 515, is that the government exhibit number for the source document that we're seeing on the left of our screen?
Yes.
Ms. Loftus, we can take up 515 and leave up Z13. Mr. Foley, generally speaking. The exercise that we just went through. Is that the process that you undertook to verify the accuracy of the information in Z13?
It is.
If we could just read through some of the entries on this chart, Mr. Foley. So starting with the first entry, what was the date of that loan agreement?
January 15, 2021.
Who was the lender?
G Club Operation, LLC.
Who was the borrower for that loan?
Jovial Century International Limited.
And what individual signed that loan agreement on behalf of Jovial Century International Limited?
Howren he.
And who was listed in that loan agreement as the fund receiver?
Fiesta Property Developments, Limited.
And what was the amount and the currency for that loan?
It was £10 million sterling.
Do you know what GBP stands for?
I do not.
Ms. Loftus, could we please pull up GXGC 544? That's the source document for this entry. If we can't do that, let's go back to Z13. If we could zoom in on the text portion so it's a bit larger, please. Mr. Foley. On this document on the bottom left there. Do you see kind of a key that indicates what italic indicate on this summary chart?
Yes.
What do the italics indicate?
The loan was not fully executed.
What does that mean, not fully executed?
It was missing one or more of the signatures.
And looking at the entries on this summary chart. Are the italics for the execution status of the loan documents, are those listed in the GX column on the far right?
Yes.
Now, the loans that are reflected on this summary chart, Mr. Foley. What was the total US dollar and/or other currency amount of loans that were fully executed based on the exhibits you reviewed?
Total was $110 million and £10 million sterling.
And what was the total of the loans reflected on this chart that were not fully executed, either missing one or both signatures?
$192 million and 10 million Swiss francs.
Do you know what CHF stands for?
I do not.
And looking, Mr. Foley, at the next box, the total combined for all of the loans reflected on this chart. What is the total US dollar amount and the total amount additionally in GBP and CHF?
$302 million, £10 million sterling and 10 million Swiss francs.
Focusing again on those first. Or the second and third entry that we looked at the document for the Hamilton Digital Assets, Ms. Loftus. If we could please pull up GXSCB 13 and go to the second page. If we could zoom in on the text portion, please. Mr. Foley, have you ever seen this before?
I have not.
What is the entity name listed on the top left here?
Hamilton Digital Assets FDSP.
Looking on the right, what is the text that's indicated on the right of this government exhibit?
US dollar transactions from January 1, 2021 to January 18, 2022.
Mr. Foley, the way you read the second date there, can you explain why you read it in that manner?
It's date, month, year.
Ms. Loftus, focusing on the first two lines here. Mr. Foley, do you see that first entry? Can you read the transaction date and the value date?
The transaction date was May 6, 2021, and the value was $20 million.
And what is listed under payment receipt, description?
Payment receipt G Club Operations, LLC.
Mr. Foley, same question for the second line there. What is the transaction date listed?
May 13, 2021.
What's the description of that particular transaction?
Payment receipt G Club Operations, LLC.
And then looking in the credit column, what is the amount of that transaction?
$15 million.
So let's go back please, Ms. Loftus, to Z13. Mr. Foley, the information we just saw on that bank record. Is that the same information reflected in the second and third row of this summary chart?
It is.
I'd like to look at one other example with you. If we could look a few rows down. There's an entry on June 23, 2021. Do you see that, Mr. Foley?
Yes.
Can you read the lender for that particular transaction and the lender's signatory?
The lender is G Club Operations LLC and the lender signatory is Limori Reyes Molinares.
And what is the borrower and the borrower's signatory for that entry?
The borrower is G Club International Limited and the borrower signatory is Howren He.
What's the fund receiver listed for this particular loan?
Yield Ester LP.
Do you know what Yield Ester is?
I do not.
Ms. Loftus, if we can pull up Government Exhibit 1639. If we could go to the next page, please. Mr. Foley looking at, if we could zoom in on the first two items on this page, please. Looking at item 1. What is listed as the dollar amount of this loan?
$3 million.
And under item 2, can you read the first sentence of that up until the words, registered address?
The borrower intends to use the loan to invest in Yield Ester LP, fund receiver, registered in Delaware, USA, and having its registered address at.
We can zoom out of that. Going to the first page, focusing on the top portion. Pardon, the second page. What is the effective date of this particular loan agreement?
June 21, 2021.
The lender entities that are listed here?
G Club Operations LLC.
And the borrower entities that are listed here?
G Club International Limited.
Ms. Loftus, we can zoom out of that. Finally, Mr. Foley, there's an entry on Z13, if we can pull that up. Ms. Loftus. It's on the bottom quarter of the chart. The date is November 23, 2021. Do you see that?
Yes.
What is the lender for that loan and the lender's signatory? November 23, 2021 is what we're looking at.
The lender is G Club Operations LLC, and the lender signatory is Limori Reyes Molinares.
And the borrower and the signatory for the borrower to that loan?
The borrower is G Club International Limited, and the borrower signatory is Howren He.
And what is the dollar amount of that loan from G Club Operations LLC to G Club International Limited?
$50 million.
Ms. Loftus, if we could please go to Government Exhibit MER 204 and go to row 135. Mr. Foley. Have you ever seen this document before?
No, I have not.
There are some column titles along the top row 1 in this document. Do you see the title for the column B entity?
Yes.
What is listed as the entity for the row that's highlighted row 135?
G Club International Limited.
And what is the date listed?
December 2nd, 2021.
What type of transaction does this reflect?
A withdrawal.
And what is the dollar amount of that withdrawal?
$50 million.
Thank you, Ms. Loftus. We can go back to Z13 one more time. Mr. Foley. On this exhibit there are a couple of asterisks that are indicated and some text on the bottom left. Do you see that?
Yes.
Is that information that's reflected in the source loan documents that you reviewed?
It is.
And does that indicate that certain of these entries reflect amendments to other entries that are the loan chart?
Yes.
Mr. Foley, looking at the last entry as an example. Borrower and borrower signatory are listed as Kaangwa. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you know who that individual is?
I do not.
Ms. Murray said, "May I have a moment, Your Honor?"
The court said you may.
Ms. Murray said, "Thank you, Your Honor." Mr. Foley, aside from your testimony today, do you have any knowledge of any facts in this case?
I do not.
Did you have any involvement in the government's investigation in this case beyond reviewing the summary chart and the underlying exhibits for accuracy?
No, I did not.
Ms. Murray said, "Nothing further, Your Honor."
The court said, cross-examination.
Cross-examination. By Mr. Skirick.
Good afternoon, Mr. Foley. Good afternoon. You testified that you're a paralegal with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Correct. That the government lawyer first asked you to testify in this case just about a week ago, right? Correct. And you didn't really know anything about this case before the folks sitting at the government table asked you to testify. Fair? Correct. And you didn't do any paralegal work for the folks sitting at the government's table in connection with this case. I did not, no. And you didn't investigate any of the loans or investments that you just went through in the chart. Fair? Fair. And so really the only thing that you know is what I think we sort of covered on direct is what the government lawyer showed you. Fair? Correct. Now, how many times did you meet with the government lawyers before you testified here today? 2 to 3 times. Including this morning? Not this morning, no. Yesterday. Briefly maybe. Fair enough. Now, the chart GXE13 that you just looked at a few moments ago, you didn't make that chart. Right. No, I did not, no. Who made it? AUSA Julie Murray. And how many drafts of this draft were there? I'm not aware of how many drafts there were before it was given to me. Unfair question. How many drafts are you aware of? 3. And you were only asked to review the chart for accuracy based on the information that you were given. Right. Correct. And is it fair to say that you were only given the documents that showed up in the far right-hand column of that chart? Correct. And if we could just pull up the chart for reference briefly. Just to be clear for the jury. When I said the columns in the far right column, that's the GX column, right? Correct. That's all you had access to. Yes. Now, as a result, you didn't really review any additional G Club document that might have been related to these loans, fair? Fair, just the items in the far right column. You didn't have access to a review, for example, of any related corporate resolutions. No. Or any related email correspondence. No. Or any other documents that may have explained what the reasons or purpose of any of the transactions were. Right. No. And you also didn't review any bank records, is that fair too? No. Is it accurate to say you didn't review any bank records, just to be clear? Just the loan records here. Now, we'll just go back to the chart here briefly. At the top the title reads G Club Loan Agreements and Select Investments, right? Correct. And Select Investments withdrawn. The select investments that are referred to in the title in this chart, those were selected by the prosecutors. Right. Yes. So it's not all investments, right, as far as you know. I have no knowledge of that. In any event, the chart says select investments. Yes. I want to clarify one thing that I think you testified to on direct, just to be clear. I believe you may have testified that the documents that you looked at were loan payments. Now I think we just cleared up that you didn't really look at any payments, right? They were loan agreements. Loan agreements. You didn't look at bank records. So you don't know whether there were actually any payments related to these loan agreements, right? Correct. Just to be clear, we're not talking about payments when we looked at this schedule.
Ms. Murray said, asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
I'll move on. Now, there are two separate G Club entities listed in this chart, is that right? Correct. G Club operations. Yes. If we're focusing on the first row under lender, and then there's G Club International Limited. For example, on the July 26, 2021 entry, right? Correct. And those are different entities, right? They have different names. As far as you know, different entities.
Ms. Murray said, asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
Now, the loans for both of these entities are put together in the same chart though, right? Yes. Now, if we could just highlight the first row, the January 15, 2021 row. Now, with the exception of row 1 that we're looking at here. For every loan that this chart says that G Club's operations made, G Club's International is the borrower, is that right? And I want you to take a second to look at it closely to make sure that you understand. Sorry. Could you repeat the question one more time? Sure. And I think if we move that up so the witness can take a look at the chart. Can you see the balance of the chart here? Yes. So the question is, for every loan made by G Club's operations, G Club's International is the borrower. That is correct. And to your understanding, is G Club International the sole member of G Club's operations? I have no knowledge of that. Well, let's see if we can pull up GX 1630. If we can go to page 2, please. Now, GX 1630 is among the documents that you reviewed in preparing this chart, right? Correct. And if we can please zoom in on the top where it says lender and borrower. If we can just focus on the whereas clause that's in the middle there under recitals. Do you see there at the top where it says, whereas the borrower is lender's sole member? Yes. Does that indicate to you that the borrower here, G Club International, is the sole member of G Club's operations?
Ms. Murray said, objection, Your Honor, document speaks for itself.
The court said, sustained.
Do you see that there? Yes. Now, the sole member means that G Club International owns G Club operations, right?
Ms. Murray said, objection, Your Honor.
The court said, sustained.
Mr. Skirek said, I'm asking his understanding. He put together the chart.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, that misrepresent his testimony. He verified the accuracy of the chart. He did not prepare it. This is beyond direct.
Mr. Skirek said, I didn't characterize his testimony. I'm asking his understanding.
The court said, do you understand?
The witness said, do I understand what the borrower is the lender's sole member means?
The court said, is that the question?
I'm asking if he understands that that means that G Club's International owns G Club's operation as the sole member, There's no other members. I have no way of verifying that. Do you know what member means in the context of a limited liability corporation? Not in this context, no. So you reading what we just reviewed on GX 1630. That doesn't mean anything to you about the ownership of the entities.
Ms. Murray said, asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
Now, if we go to, I'll move on from this. If we can please go to pull up, actually, you know what? Let's do this quickly. If we can go back to 1630 and scroll to page 2. We're going to go to GC 544. Again, Mr. Foley. This is one of the documents that you reviewed in connection with the chart. I believe so, yes. And now this is called a facility agreement. Do you see that? Yes. And it's entered into between 3 entities, G Club Operations, Jovial Century International Limited and Fiesta Property Developments. You see that? Correct. If we can scroll down to page 2 under Parties. And we can see here that the lender is G Club's Operations. Correct. And the borrower is Jovial Century International, right? Correct. And if we go to the top of if we go down a little bit further. The fund receiver is Fiesta Property Development, right? Yes. Now if we scroll down to the background section, you see the background section. Yes. And it says there, the borrower is the 100% shareholder of lender, right? Yes. Does that mean to you that Jovial, which is the borrower, is the 100% owner of G Club's operation?
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, objection. The document speaks for itself.
The court said, sustained.
We'll keep reading here. The next sentence says, the ultimate beneficial owner of the borrower is the same as that of the fund receiver. Do you see that? Yes. Do you know what ultimate beneficial owner means? Not in this context. I believe you testified on direct that Mr. He was the ultimate beneficial owner of one of the entities.
Ms. Murray said, objection, mischaracterizes his testimony.
The court said, sustained.
The relationship between and amongst the entities listed in this chart, if any, isn't displayed in the chart, is that fair? Just the relationship of lender and receiver. So, in other words, just to be clear. In other words, to the extent that some or more than one of these entities owns the other entities or has an interest in the other entities. That's not reflected in the chart. Yes. Is it also true that the terms of the loan agreements are not reflected in this chart? That is correct. Now, if we just go back to the chart GXE 13. Now, is it fair to say that with the exception of the first entry in this chart for which the underlying agreement we just reviewed? Is that fair? We just reviewed that underlying agreement. Yes. With the exception of that entry and agreement. This chart does not reflect any of the underlying agreements between the borrower and the fund receiver.
Ms. Murray said, objection to form, Your Honor.
The court said, sustained.
Does the chart, apart from the first entry, reflect any relationship between the borrower and the fund receiver?
Ms. Murray said, object to form. Again, I'm not sure what the question is.
I'll back it up. So the chart reflects a relationship between the lender and the borrower, right? Like it characterizes one entity as the lender and it characterizes another as a borrower. Correct. It's reflecting a relationship between the two entities.
Ms. Murray said, objection to the follow-up question about the relationship.
The court said, so you can take the questions separately. He answered yes to the characterization of one party as the lender and the other as the borrower. Now you can ask the relationship question.
Sure. One column shows that a certain set of entities is the lender and the other column shows that the other set of entities is a borrower. Fair? Yes. Would you agree with me that that means that the chart reflects the nature of the relationship between them as to the transactions listed here? Yes. Now, if we move to the right with this chart, the relationship between the borrower entity in that column and the relationship between the fund receiver entity is not reflected in this chart. Right.
Ms. Murray said, objection to form again.
The court said, if you know you may answer.
I'm not sure what the relationship between the borrower and fund receiver is. Right. The chart doesn't say what the relationship is between the borrower and fund receiver is.
Ms. Murray said, asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, I'm just clarifying the witness's answer. That's all.
The court said, You're asking the question a second time. That's what you're doing.
For example, you can't tell from this chart why the fund receiver, again apart from the first entry, why the fund receiver received the funds or why the borrower may have engaged in a transaction with the fund receiver. Right.
Ms. Murray said, calls for speculation.
The court said, You can ask him what the document states. Is that what you're asking?
Mr. Skirek said, I believe that's what I asked, Your Honor, whether one can tell from the chart.
The court said, Well, that's a different question. You're asking whether a person can interpret the chart to mean a certain thing.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, I believe he testified to the creation of this chart. I'm just asking whether he can tell the person who helped create it what the relationship is between the fund receiver and the borrower.
Ms. Murray said, again, Your Honor, mischaracterizes Mr. Foley's testimony in his role. He did not create the chart.
The court said, He did not create the chart.
Mr. Skirek said, But he's familiar with the chart.
The court said, Yes, to the extent of his limited role.
Mr. Skirek said, Sure. Your Honor. I think it's fair to ask whether given his role in helping to work on this chart whether he can tell something that maybe I can't tell from it.
The court said, Well, you're asking him to interpret the chart.
Mr. Skirek said, As someone who helped create it, someone who had a hand in generating.
The court said, Yes, he played a role in generating the chart. Were you asked to interpret the chart?
The witness said, No, just verify for accuracy.
The court said, Move on.
By Mr. Skirek.
Is it fair to say that there are no agreements between the entities listed as borrowers and the entities listed as receivers, or you just don't know? I do not know. So if there were other contracts that govern the relationship as entities listed as borrower and an entity listed as fund receiver, that's just something you don't know about, right? I only reviewed the underlying exhibits listed on the right-hand side. And the government gave you those underlying exhibits, right? Correct. Now I like to draw your attention to the second and third rows of the chart. The second row, if we can just highlight briefly, is dated May 6, 2021, and the third row is dated May 13, 2021. Correct. And in both of these rows, the lender is G Club's operations, right? Yes. And there is no lender signatory indicated in the chart, right? Correct. And the fund receiver is Hamilton Digital Asset FDSP, right? Correct. And the first entry is for 20 million. Yes. And the second entry is for 15. Yes. Can we please pull up GXGC 515? If we can blow up the relevant portion of that. Now. It doesn't say anywhere on this document that this is a loan, right? No, it does not. It doesn't say borrower here anywhere, right? No, it doesn't. Doesn't say lender here anywhere. It does not. This is a letter of direction, right? Correct. But this is included in the chart that we looked at labeled loans, right? Yes, I believe it was labeled loans and select investment. Is there anything on the face of this document that we're looking at right now which was included as an underlying exhibit to the chart that indicates that this transaction was a loan?
Ms. Murray said, asked and answered, Your Honor.
Mr. Skirek said, I don't think I asked that particular question.
The court said, Sir, do you hold a license to practice law in the state of New York?
The witness said, No, I do not.
The court said, Don't ask him legal questions.
If we could just hold on to this document. But also bring up alongside it Government Exhibit 1630 and go to the last page, the signature page if we could. It may be the second to last page. Now, this is another one of the documents, 1630. That's included as a source document for the chart. Correct. And you see here on the signature line it says lender G Club operations. Yes. And on the other signature line it says borrower G Club International. Yes. Now, you don't see similar words on the other exhibit GXGC 515, right? No. And we can take that down. Thank you. And if we could please go back to the chart GXC 13. If we can go to the entry dated July 21, 2021. This lists the lender as G Club Operations. I'm sorry, the July 21st entry, not 26. So this shows that G Club Operations is the lender, right? Correct. And the borrower is G Club International. Yes. And borrower signatory is Mr. He. Yes. And the fund receiver is Himalaya International Clearing Limited, right? Yes. And the amount is for $25 million, right? Yes. And this row summarizes the source document GXGC 221, right? Yes. If we can just please go quickly to GXGC 221. If we can go to page 4 of the PDF, which is the first page of the agreement. This is a loan agreement between G Club Operations and G Club International, right? Yes. Now, if we can just go to the second to last page of this, the signature page. And this, I believe you testified on direct that there were some agreements that didn't have withdrawn. You testified on direct that there were some agreements that weren't fully executed, right? Correct. And is this one of those? Yes. Now, if we can go back to the beginning of the document to the whereas clauses. And we can just focus on the second whereas clause. It says, subject to the terms of this agreement. Lender will loan $25 million to borrower, right? Yes. And it says, whereas for efficiency purpose and pursuant to borrower's request. Lender will send the loan proceeds directly to the Himalayan International Clearing on borrower's behalf. You see that? Yes. Now, let's go back to the summary chart GXC 13. And if we go down to the entry dated July 27, 2021. There's that little asterisk there. You see that? Yes. And if we go down to the key at the bottom of the chart, that asterisk indicates the amendment. This agreement is an amendment to the July 21, 2021 agreement. Yes. We just looked at the July 21 agreement, right? Correct. Now let's look at the July 27 agreement, and if we can just pull up before we look at the agreement itself. July 21 entry and the July 27 entry, and all the way up to the 21st entry. And now we'll just looking at the entry for the July 21 and July 27 entry carefully. Is it fair to say that the only difference between these is that there's a different fund receiver? The fund receiver, the date, and the underlying government exhibit number. Yes. Thank you. You're right. The only difference in the terms of the loan is the fund receiver. Right.
The court said, here we go again. He's not an attorney. He cannot give you legal definitions. He cannot define the terms.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, I'm sorry. I wasn't asking him to define terms. I was asking him to verify that the only difference in the entries on the chart.
The court said, he can read. He can tell you what is on the chart.
So the difference here is that Yield Esta is the fund receiver, right?
Ms. Murray said, asked and answered.
The court said, sustained.
Let's just pull up now the underlying exhibit, which is GX 1636, if we can just blow up the recitals there. And it says, whereas the parties entered into the loan agreement on July 21st. You see that? Yes. And again, that's the other agreement that we looked at, right, a second ago.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, objection. Mr. Foley is a summary witness and these documents speak for themselves.
The court said, sustained.
If we go down to the final whereas clause, it says, the parties wish to amend the agreement to authorize and direct the lender to send $25 million of loan proceeds of the agreement directly to Yield Esta instead of the Himalayan International Clearing Limited.
Ms. Murray said, same objection, Your Honor.
The court said, I haven't heard the question yet.
Mr. Skirek said, I'm simply asking him to confirm that I've read that correctly.
Ms. Murray said, same objection.
The court said, so the document speaks for itself.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, may we have a brief sidebar?
The court said yes.
Continued on next page. At the sidebar,
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, the last question was merely to ask the witness if I read that correctly. Even with a summary witness, my understanding is that I'm permitted to ask the witness if I read the document correctly. It's one of the source documents in the chart. And I'm trying to show that there were changes in the agreements that are not reflected in the chart. And I'm not sure how I can do that without being able to question the witness about what the underlying documents are.
The court said, so the chart lists the underlying documents?
Mr. Skirek said, correct. And I'm going through them to show that there are changes in the transactions that are not reflected in the chart. And it goes directly to the integrity of the chart, the reliability of the chart, which I think is highly relevant.
Ms. Murray said, Your Honor, the continued objections to documents speak for themselves is largely for efficiency. This is a summary witness. He's testified to verifying the accuracy of the chart. We've moved in the exhibits that support the entries in the chart, and they are listed. So the defense can go and look at those underlying exhibits. But Mr. Foley simply confirmed the accuracy of what's in the chart itself. And I don't see from what Mr. Skirek is saying that the chart is inaccurate. Based on the documents, it accurately reflects the charts in the document.
Mr. Skirek said, If I can respond to that, Your Honor, that is where I'm going because I believe the chart is inaccurate. The only way I can do that and show that through a witness is to be able to ask the witness questions about the underlying document. I understand the government has to object where it needs to object. But I would be through this already if there weren't continued objections about me just trying to establish underlying facts.
The court said, so he can read the title of a document. He can read from a document, but he can't tell you what it means.
Mr. Skirek said, I understand. Your Honor has made that point, and I think what I'm doing here. I haven't asked a question. You can check the record. I have not asked a question about what anything means. I'm simply asking him to confirm that that information is in the underlying document.
Ms. Murray said, with respect to the particular issue that was in the last question, I'm not clear what information Mr. Skirek is saying is inaccurate in the chart.
Mr. Skirek said, we haven't gotten through the cross yet. I'm trying to elicit it through the witness. Which is the only way I have to do it.
Ms. Murray said, sure, but looking at, for example, the recitals that you just read and asking Mr. Foley to confirm. What part of that language from the document are you going to say is inaccurate in the chart itself?
Mr. Skirek said, there are two purposes in this cross, right, generally speaking. One is to show that there is information that is not in the chart so that I can demonstrate to the jury that there will be information outside of the four corners of that document that may be relevant to interpreting what's inside the document. I should be entitled to do that. The second is to show that there are inaccuracies in the chart. What you're just referring to is not in reading the recitals was not to show that the document was inaccurate. It was to show that there was other information that was not in the chart. So those are the two purposes.
The court said, so the other information that's not in the chart, there's plenty of information that's not in the chart. There are whole documents that are not in the chart. That's why he's a summary witness.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor. If there is, the defense is entitled to argue that there is other information that's relevant too.
The court said, you do that at summation for goodness sake. If you want to lose the jury completely, keep it up. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Continued on next page. In open court.
The court said, all righty. Go ahead.
Mr. Skirek said, thank you. Do you see, Mr. Foley, the portion of the document that's highlighted on your screen there? Yes. And it says, whereas the parties wish to amend the agreement. Do you see that? Yes. Now, if we can just please pull up GXGC 221, page 2, side by side with GX 1636. Now GX, actually. If it's possible to switch these. If not, that's fine. Is it fair to say based on the passage that we just read that the document and loan agreement dated July 27, 2021 replaced the loan agreement dated July 21, 2021?
The court said, one moment please.
Pause.
The court said, go ahead.
It's fair to say it's an amendment to. And so it changed the previous agreement, right? That's what amendment means.
The court said, you're asking for a legal conclusion.
Mr. Skirek said, Your Honor, he testified it's an amendment.
The court said, that's right. He's testifying to what the document states.
By Mr. Skirek.
Now, if we go back to the summary chart GXE 13 and we focus on the two lines July 21st and July 27, 2021. Now both of those entries are for $25 million. Is that right? That is correct.
Continued on next page. By Mr. Skirek.
And one of those agreements, the later agreement, changed the earlier agreement, right? As you testified before.
Ms. Murray said, "Objection, Your Honor. Mischaracterizes."
The court said, "Sustained."
I believe you testified that it amended the earlier agreement. Mr. Skirek said, "Those were the witness's words, I believe." Changed.
Ms. Murray said, "Yes, Your Honor, which is different than."
The court said, "Amended is one word, changed is another."
Mr. Skirek said, "Okay."
By Mr. Skirek.
So the later agreement amended the earlier agreement. Yet we still have $25 million in the amount column for each agreement, right? Correct. Okay. So that total calculation at the bottom of GXE 13 is overstated by at least $25 million then, correct? That I have no knowledge of. Isn't this double counting? I have no way to confirm whether or not the payments went through. Right. Because you can't tell from this chart whether there were actual transactions, right? This is just the loan agreements themselves, just the paper. This was the amount listed on the loan agreement, yes. Mr. Skirek said, "Okay. Thank you. No further questions at this time."
Ms. Murray said, "No redirect, Your Honor."
The court said, "Thank you. You may step out."
The witness said, "Thank you. Witness excused."